Christian egoism. What is it? Is it true and important? Here at For the New Christian Intellectual, we're combating blind faith, blind morality, and blind political conformity. Instead, we defend the biblical teaching, a rational faith, rational morality, rational politics. You're listening in on our exclusive monthly hangout for sustaining members. Find out how to become a sustaining member at christianintellectual.com/Patreon. I'm Cody Leibold. I'll be interviewing Jacob Brunton, followed by a seminar-style discussion among all the attendees. Today's topic is sure to be controversial: Christian egoism. Let's open with a passage that will set the scene for what we're talking about. This is Psalm 90, 10 through 17. Our days may come to 70 years, or 80, if our strength endures. Yet the best of them are but trouble and sorrow, for they quickly pass, and we fly away. If only we knew the power of your anger. Your wrath is as great as the fear that is your due. Teach us to number our days, that we may gain a heart of wisdom. Relent, Lord. How long will it be? Have compassion on your servants. Satisfy us in the morning with your unfailing love, that we may sing for joy and be glad all our days. Make us glad for as many days as you have afflicted us, for as many years as we have seen trouble. May your deeds be shown to your servants, your splendor to their children. May the favor of the Lord our God rest on us. Establish the work of our hands for us. Yes, establish the work of our hands. All right, Jacob, tell us, what is Christian egoism?
Very simply, Christian egoism is the idea that Christians ought to seek their own rational self-interest. And I'm being very honest in that I'm just borrowing that definition from Rand, because Rand's definition of egoism is that we as humans ought to seek our own rational self-interest. And so the Christian egoism really is just saying, yes, and that's appropriate within the Christian worldview. Now, a lot of the pushback comes from the fact that there are a lot of passages in the Bible and a lot of themes within the Bible that seem to contradict that. And we're very aware of that, and that's one of the things that we want to address here. And so I'm really hoping that all of you guys will have lots of fun, challenging texts to bring up, or Christian themes, or even traditions in the Christian church to bring up to challenge this idea that we ought to seek our own rational self-interest. I think that'll make for a really good discussion. But we left off last time talking about divine egoism, and that was the idea that God seeks his own rational self-interest, and that's a good thing. So it's not just that God happens to seek his own rational self-interest, but that he should be praised for that's part of his glory, that he's morally praiseworthy for seeking his own rational self-interest. And the question came up, does that automatically mean that Christians ought to? And I would say no. That's sort of an open question. So the mere fact that God is an egoist, which I think most Christians are going to agree with, I think most Christians are going to be really hard-pressed to deny the idea that God is an egoist, given everything that he says about his motivations in Scripture. So most Christians are going to admit, yes, God's an egoist, divine egoism, sure, whatever. But they're going to be really hesitant to jump from that to Christian egoism. And I want to make sure that we don't rush from divine egoism to Christian egoism, and say, just because God's an egoist, therefore that means we should be. I think that implication probably is proper, but you've got to do the work. You've got to actually work it out. And so that's what I want to kind of do. I want to walk us through what's the proper way to kind of move from divine egoism to Christian egoism as we think about these things in our theology and our discussions about the Bible. The first thing to realize is, in general, we want moral principles to be universal between God and man. In general, we don't want to have equivocation between what's morally right for God and what's morally appropriate for man. If lying is a sin, we don't want to say, well, it's okay for God to do it just because he's God. If murder is a sin, we don't want to say, well, it's okay for God to do it just because he's God. If idolatry is a sin, we don't want to say, well, it's okay for God to do it just because he's God, right? We don't want to make arbitrary exceptions for God merely because he's God when it comes to moral issues. And I think most Christians genuinely agree with that. And so when it comes to egoism, the question is, all right, are we making an arbitrary exception? Are we saying it's okay for God to be an egoist, but it's evil for man to be an egoist just because he's God? Or is there some element of divinity that makes it his case a little bit different? I think there kind of is, that there's a little bit of a difference between God and man, at least on the surface, that might make it seem like maybe it's okay for God to be an egoist, even if it's not okay for us to be. And that difference is that God is the most valuable being in all the universe. He's the most glorious being in all the universe. He would be irrational if he did not value himself as highly as he does. And that's not true of me, right? I'm not the most glorious being in all the universe. It's not irrational to value myself less than I would value God, for instance. And so it seems like, yeah, it's okay for God to be an egoist. It's not okay for man to be an egoist. That's kind of the way that most people would approach it. But I want to challenge that and dig a little bit deeper and look at the principle behind God's self-value. And that principle is the idea that you ought to value that which is objectively valuable. And that's what Edwards argues for divine egoism. That's the argument that we explored a little bit last time, the idea that you should value that which is objectively valuable. God is objectively most valuable, so God, in order to be moral, must value himself as ultimate. But let's hone in on that principle and let's examine it. What does it mean to value something that's objectively valuable? What does it mean for something to be objectively valuable? I would argue, and again, I'm pulling this from Rand for the most part, but I think a lot of other people have made similar insights. In fact, if you read Piper or Lewis or Edwards, you get similar insights. And that is that in order to value something genuinely, to really, really value something, you have to see it as valuable to yourself or as valuable for yourself. To use Piper's analogy, if he were to say to his wife, I'm taking you out on a date, I'm doing all these loving things, but not because you are of any value to me. I could be just as happy with any other woman, like Matt Chandler says. Matt Chandler says he could have been just as happy marrying any other woman. That's altruism, by the way. But if you say, I could be just as happy marrying any other woman, I'm doing this out of duty, then arguably you don't really value your wife. You're doing all of the actions that are in step with what it would look like if you valued your wife, but you don't genuinely value her. And you see this in 1 Corinthians 13 at the end of the passage, the famous love passage where Paul says, even if I give all I have to the poor and offer my body to the flames, yet have not love, it profits me nothing. There's two things to notice in that passage. The first is that Paul's saying it's possible to do loving actions, the most loving actions or apparent loving actions, which are giving everything you have to the poor, right? If I went and gave everything I have to the poor, people would look at me and say, he's so loving. And if I went a step further and died on behalf of all mankind, people would say, he's so loving. But Paul's saying you can do both of those things and not have love, which means that love, value, is something deeper than mere actions. The actions can be there without the love, without the value. And so to truly, genuinely value someone or something is to see that person as valuable to oneself. And that's the second part of what Paul says there at the end of 1 Corinthians 13. Even if you do all those apparently loving things but have not love, what? It profits you nothing. The motivation, if you're going to have genuine love, is profit, is gain. And so what it means to value something is to see it as valuable to yourself. And now we can come full circle, and most Christians would say that the essence of the Christian moral life is to glorify God, right? The Westminster Catechism says the purpose of man, or the chief end of man, is to enjoy, or to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. And Piper qualifies that and says that it's to glorify God by enjoying Him forever. And we're digging down into that and saying, what does it mean to enjoy God? Piper says you can't glorify God without enjoying Him. Yes, we agree. Now, what does it mean to enjoy God, to value God? It means to see Him as valuable to yourself, to count Him as something that is good for you. And that is the essence of what we're getting at when we talk about Christian egoism and doing or seeking that which is in your own rational self-interest. So
that gives us a pretty good understanding of what you mean by the term. And then there's a couple of other points of clarification that we need to hit. And then I think we should get into the scripture and see if we can justify this by what scripture says, as well as you've just backed it up by reason, but I think we need to do it by both.
Yes.
So one objection that people raise is, well, are you really prescribing something? Because isn't this just how everybody is all the time anyway, like automatically?
Yeah, so there's the debate or issue of what's called psychological egoism. And this can go by different descriptions. But in general, it's the idea that everyone already seeks their own self-interest. So aren't we just describing what is automatically the case? And I actually deny that. But there's a couple levels on which I deny that. So you could say everyone already seeks their own rational self-interest, which I think is patently false. Like if you just look at the fact that people are self-destructive all the time, it's obvious that people don't automatically seek their rational self-interest. You might be able to have an argument to say that everybody seeks their apparent self-interest, where everybody does what seems like is in their best self-interest all the time. And that's a little bit more plausible. But then that's already different from what we're saying, because there's a distinction between what seems to be in your self-interest and what is objectively rationally in your self-interest.
And I would even deny that.
Exactly. Even there's a further distinction that needs to be made, because I would deny that everybody seeks even what they think is in their self-interest. I think a lot of people are intentionally self-destructive. Or to put it another way, I think a lot of people have an idea in their minds of what is in their self-interest, and they don't want it. Because they've got irrational and disordered desires, they seek something that they know to be against their own self-interest. And we see this often too. There are lots of cases where someone knows that something's wrong for them, for instance, a drug habit, and yet they do it anyways. Although there you could argue that there's some sort of chemical dependency going on. So, discard drugs and look at lying. There are lots of instances where people know that lying is wrong. Or take Romans 1. Paul says that the Gentiles know that these things are wrong, know that they deserve God's wrath for doing them, and yet they continue to do them. In fact, they give hearty approval to others doing likewise. So even in Scripture, we have at least one example. I would argue lots more examples of people doing what they know to be against their own self-interest. So I don't think it's true that people always act in their own self-interest, let alone their own rational self-interest. I do think it's true that, and this is probably what people are getting at, and they just don't realize it because they're not being real careful. I do think it's true that people do what they most desire at a given time. I think that's true. Everyone does what they most desire at a given time. But there's no reason to think that what someone most desires at a given time is either what they believe to be in their self-interest or what's actually in their self-interest. And I think those are the clarifications that people are failing to make when they claim that psychological egoism is the case.
So psychological egoism is a claim. It's a claim that something is descriptively true. And we can differentiate that from from ethical egoism, which is a prescription of what you ought to do.
Yes.
And then we can also say that psychological egoism as a theory is not descriptively true.
Yeah. In fact, what's interesting is if psychological egoism was true, that would preclude ethical egoism from being true, right? Because ethical egoism is a prescription. It's an ought. You ought to seek your rational self-interest. Well, if everybody automatically does that anyways, then the oughtness of it is a moot point. So so the two are actually in conflict, and you actually see that quite a bit when you debate egoism, ethical egoism with people. A lot of people dismiss it because they believe in psychological egoism, and so they see no need for an ethical demand to seek your rational self-interest. They think, oh, well, we do that automatically anyways.
You know, a lot of times when I've discussed egoism with people, I've realized that people have a view of egoism that is cynical. And what I hear is, oh, but everybody's just out for their own anyway. So imagine that you see somebody coming out of the store and he's holding those flowers and he's going to bring them to his wife. What kind of person looks at that and says, he's just trying to make his wife happy so he can get what he wants? Rather, wouldn't you want to be the kind of person who looks at that and says, wow, he cares about his wife and he wants to have a great life with her. And that's an admirable thing that he's going out of his way to bring about causes and effects. That's good. So, but this cynical view of egoism, it's interesting because, you know, if I try to advocate for egoism being good, a lot of times people say, oh, well, if I were an egoist, then I would just go steal from everybody all the time. And my question to them is, what makes you think that that would be in your rational self-interest to do that? What kind of person thinks that? So there's all these objections that we could get to.
Well, let me interject real fast. The type of person who thinks that is the type of person who hasn't learned what it means to value or to have objective long-term values that are rational, because that capacity has been beaten out of them by the morality of altruism. If you're taught that it's evil to value things for yourself, to value that which is objectively valuable for yourself, then you're not going to be in the habit of identifying things that are objectively long-term really valuable for you. You're going to be in the habit of living off of the range of the moment, because that's the only thing that's available to you on the moral code that you've accepted.
So to clarify some terms, we have egoism as an ethical theory, and it's a theory that says this is what kind of things are accomplished by a moral code. Now, there's actually several different types of egoism. You could refer to there could be such thing as cynical egoism. The one that we're advocating is rational egoism. So it's different from, for example, Nietzsche is a famous example of someone who just basically said he said that might makes right. That's certainly not what we're saying. Trampling on other people, certainly not what we're saying. So distinguish egoism from that. Now let's distinguish egoism from one other term that we keep bringing up, and that is altruism.
Yeah, so altruism is the idea that, and it's kind of multifaceted because it's inconsistent, so people switch it. But I like to give a disjunctive definition to encapsulate both possible meanings that people swing from. So one idea behind altruism and its basic meaning is otherism. That's literally what the term means. Alter, otherism, altruism. So it means that others ought to be your ultimate moral motivation, your ultimate motivation in all of your moral actions. Often included in it is the idea of self-denial as an end in itself. And the reason I say as an end in itself is because it's important to understand that when we're talking about egoism and altruism, we're talking about moral principles. We're talking about moral ideals, and they have to do with our motivations. And it's possible to have layered motivations, right? So if someone asks me, why did I go to the store this morning? Well, I went to the store to get bread. Well, why did you go to the store to get bread? Well, because I wanted to eat. Well, why did you want to eat? Well, because I wanted to live, right? So there's a whole chain of motivations that you can talk about. And so when we're talking about motivations, what we want to identify is what's the ultimate, what's the end point, the stopping point for the motivational chain. And so when we're talking about the morality of your motivations, when we're talking about moral codes that encompass your motivations, we want to ask what ought to be the end point of your motivational chain. What ought to be your ultimate motive, not some penultimate motive lower down the line or lower down the chain. We're talking about the ultimate. And that's why there's the dichotomy between egoism and altruism, right? Rational egoism says that your ultimate motivation ought to be that which is in your own rational self-interest. Whereas altruism would say your ultimate motivation ought to be that which is either in your own self-denial or in the good of others, irrespective of the good for you, right? And the reason altruism has that disjunct, either what's bad for you or good for others, is because, like I said, the advocates of altruism tend to swing back and forth between those two things. And really, those two things boil down to the same thing, which is self-abasement.
It's really difficult to follow a moral code of altruism consistently. So there's hardly any examples, because the most consistent thing that you could do if self-abasement was your standard would be to kill yourself. Or there's other things like just not eating, not taking care of yourself. So typically altruists will justify self-care as a means to the end. So that's where you have to think in principle. You have to say, the reason you are justifying your feeding yourself, clothing yourself, working, making money, having a house, is because you think that it's okay as long as a huge chunk of everything you produce goes to somebody else. And that's the justification. So you're ultimately saying you have to live for somebody else's sake. And if that's what you say, that would be altruism.
Yeah, so it's really important to understand when we're talking about these ideals, these moral ideals, we're talking about ultimate motivations. An altruistic life can look very self-interested, and a very self-interested life can look very altruistic. So appearances can be deceiving. You have to look beyond immediate actions. You have to look beyond immediate intentions to one's ultimate motivation. This is all about motivations, and it's all about the ultimate motivation.
Jacob, can I ask you, how did you first come to think of this set of terms and these set of questions? And how did you go from not being an advocate of ethical, rational egoism to being an advocate?
Yeah, I don't know that I have a real strong, clear story. But my first memory of wrestling with this is shortly after I became a Christian. And I had preached to me in youth group and things. I became a Christian at 17. So I was going to youth group, and that was my only source of Christianity at that point. And I had preached to me the idea that he must increase and I must decrease, right? From John, that's John the Baptist talking about Jesus and how John the Baptist must decrease and Jesus must increase. But that was preached to me as sort of a moral ideal for my Christian life, that the degree to which I decrease in importance and in value and in emphasis and in the way I think about myself and in valuing myself, the more God would increase. And I wanted God to increase. I had a voracious love for the glory of God. I really did. And I had this idea in my head that there was an inverse ratio between the glory of God and the significance of my own life. And so I would pray that prayer, God, please decrease me so that you will be increased. And I began to pray one night, even that he would send me to hell if that's what it took for him to be glorified in my life. But then I paused, and I hesitated to pray that, because I realized that in hell, I wouldn't get to see the extra glory that he would get from me being in hell, right? So the idea is I want him to be glorified, and in order for him to be glorified, I'm willing to go to hell, but that would preclude me enjoying the extra glory he would get from me going to hell for his glory. And I thought, well, wait a second. The whole reason that I'm sort of offering myself to go to hell here is so that I could enjoy his glory. But that would undermine me enjoying his glory. And in effect, I would be saying that I don't care about his glory by offering to go to hell for the sake of him being glorified. And right around the time that I was wrestling with this, because this was an existential crisis for me as a young Christian, I didn't know what to do with it. I just knew that there was a problem. And right around that time, I discovered Piper. And that was sort of a saving grace, because Piper taught me that God is glorified in my enjoyment of him. And so that was sort of a step up out of that dilemma of realizing that, okay, I don't have to feel bad about not wanting to go to hell, because God is glorified in my enjoyment of him. That's how he's glorified. So I should want to go to heaven in order to glorify him. But there was still the idea that the more I worked to actively glorify him in my life, the more I was focusing on my life, right? On my ministry, on my knowledge of Scripture, or my knowledge of theology, and my desires, cultivating my own desires for God. It was me. Aren't you being selfish? And so there was still this nagging idea in the back of my head that there was something wrong. And it wasn't really until I discovered Ayn Rand and really started to dig into her philosophy and learn the rational philosophical arguments for rational egoism and against altruism, and then started to second guess the altruism I've been taught in Christianity and started to read the Bible sort of with these new eyes, that I realized, wait a second, altruism isn't in the Bible. And it was really freeing, because it made me realize it's not bad for me to care about my life. It's bad for me to be irrational in caring about my life. But if I'm caring about my life in a rational way, and as a Christian, that means in a God-glorifying way, that's good. That's the essence of Christian morality. And that was extremely freeing to me, because it made me realize I don't have to apologize for focusing on learning to know God better with my mind, or learning to cultivate passions, my own passions, for the glory of God, or wanting to expand my ministry, because it was all aimed at what is objectively good and glorifying to God.
Thank you for sharing that. That really helps. And I think some of the other guys on here, myself included, can share a same story, where the way we understood Scripture was being influenced by the way we heard it preached. And when we looked at it for ourselves without the assumption that the altruistic framework was true, then we saw a different message altogether. And in fact, we saw we'd basically been reading the Scripture through an exegetical lens. So in order to help all of our viewers see Scripture for what it is, we put together a collection, and you can find that. It's available at christianintellectual.com/egoism. This is a collection of New Testament verses, and these are verses that either tend toward supporting the argument for egoism, or tend away from supporting the argument, tend to support an argument toward altruism. Now, I don't actually think any of them tend to support an argument toward altruism. But these are verses that often come up. We've had many, many discussions, and so we've taken the time to list them out. These are the verses that people bring up. And some of them are what you would say a problem verse. Like there's one in 2 Timothy 3:2 where Paul condemns people for being lovers of self. So how is that consistent with a historical Christian doctrine that self-love is right in some ways? So these are things that if we want to advocate for this theory, ethical egoism, we do have to have something to say about it. So I would encourage you go to christianintellectual.com/egoism and just look at the verses. They're highlighted so that I showed these are the ones that I considered to be most strongly in support of egoism. These are the ones that I considered, if egoism is true, you would probably need to think through it and understand what your position is on how to understand that verse. Also, some of the viewers today have brought in their own verses. So, Jacob, I'll let you decide what you want to look at next.
Actually, I think I'd like to open it up to discussion. I've got quite a few other remarks that I could delve into in terms of aspects of Christian egoism and objections against it. But I think you guys all have some pretty lively questions, most likely. So let's go ahead and open it up for questions.
Tony, you had messaged me with, let's look at 1 Corinthians 10:24 and 10:33. So go ahead, and if you want to unmute yourself, you can explain what your question is there, and I can read the verses. I have them up in front of me.
Could you read them, please?
Sure. So 1 Corinthians 10:24, let no one seek his own good, but the good of his neighbor. And then the next one is just a few verses later in verse 33, even as I please all men in all things, not seeking my own profit, but the profit of many, that they may be saved. So this is all from one passage. So let's start with that one. Tony, can you explain what do you see as the potential problem with these verses?
So I don't think those verses negate ethical egoism for the Christian, because our view of the afterlife, with our view of the afterlife, we will benefit from acting against our worldly self-interest. So it almost seems as though the way we distinguish between psychological egoism and ethical egoism, those verses make me feel as though we should distinguish between worldly altruism and ethical altruism, because they do ask for us to self-sacrifice for others' salvation in this life, even though that doesn't necessarily negate ethical egoism, because in the long run, in the next life, we will benefit from it. But in this world, there seems to be a call for altruism in a sense, but not the way that the leftists would use it.
You want to comment on that one, Jacob?
Yeah, you're wrong.
Good, I'm glad I'm wrong.
I'm only half kidding. So a few things. It's important to understand what, at essence, we're talking about when we talk about egoism and altruism. And I mentioned this a little bit earlier. We're talking about ultimate motivations, not appearances. And I'll grant you, there is the appearance of altruism in many passages in Scripture, not just those. There's the appearance of altruism in Christ on the cross. And that's one of the reasons that Rand and many objectivists are turned off to Christianity, is because of the very vivid appearance of altruism there. There's the appearance of altruism with Abraham sacrificing Isaac, along with appearance of mysticism. And so what I want to say is we need to look past the appearance here, past the surface, and look at ultimate motivations. And you granted, even, Tony, that it's almost like altruism in this life, but then the reward, the self-interest, comes in the next life. And that's true, and that makes it sort of egoistic, like you said. But I want to argue that there's even more than that, that it's not the case that we have to appeal ultimately to the afterlife as the ultimate rationalization or justification for our egoism. I think there's a really good case to be made from Scripture that there is a joy and a rational value to be had in seeking the salvation of other people in the here and now. So here's the way I think about it, and here's the way I think the Bible wants us to think about it, but I'm just going to speak for myself for a second. The way I think about it is I love the glory of God. Like, I really, really, really love the glory of God. I want to see God glorified to the max in every way possible. In fact, that's what the new heavens and new earth is going to be. It's not going to be some ineffable floating on a cloud playing a harp with, just bright light shining on me. And it's going to be living as a man on a physical world with physical reality, building things with my hands, with my mind, interacting with people in society, probably having business, capitalist utopia most likely, all to the glory of God. All of those things glorifying God in the way we interact with each other physically on earth. It's just going to be a new earth. It's going to be glorious. And I want that here. I want that now. And one of the first steps to seeing that take place now is converting people to Christianity so that they can see the light of the gospel of the glory of God in the face of Jesus, so that they can see the glory of God and join me in pursuing it on this earth with the material that we have around us in business, in society, in culture, in politics. So when you have that mindset, then it's really easy to see how, yeah, I want lots of people in on this. I want to save as many souls as possible, but not just for the afterlife. Yes, for the afterlife, absolutely for the afterlife, but not just for the afterlife, for the here and now.
So yeah, I definitely see what you mean, and that explanation is compelling. So rather than distinguishing between altruism and this life versus the next, the way that I was trying to do, it seems as though it's still a call for lack of a better term, materialistic altruism, calling us to sacrifice our material well-being in order to get spiritual, ethical joy and self-interest. So
Sure.
that's kind of see where I'm seeing a dichotomy still.
Sure. And again, I think you're right. It has that appearance, but let's step back and analyze it. Does the Bible call us to material self-sacrifice as an end in itself in all contexts?
No.
Or is it only in the context where material self-sacrifice is necessary for the sake of a higher value, which happens to be a spiritual value? And I think you're nodding, yes, that's the case. And let me point out, that's the case in Rand's philosophy as well. If you read Atlas Shrugged, this is one of the major themes in Atlas Shrugged. Look at the heroes of the story. Look at the things they say, especially to Dagny and to Reardon, about why they gave up their material wealth. Galt says, real fast so that we don't have any spoilers. I mean, people who are watching this later are going to get spoiled, but that's okay. Have you guys all read Atlas Shrugged, just so I know where we're at? Okay, so Galt says, I won't get too specific, but Galt says at one point, I had to give up that material wealth. I'll leave it vague and call it material wealth. Very, very valuable material wealth. I had to give that up for the sake of what it meant to me. I had to let it perish forever, he says, right? And Francisco says the same thing, right? All of the heroes, that's one of the major themes in Atlas Shrugged, is the supremacy of spiritual values over material values, because spiritual values give the meaning and the essence to the material values. The material values don't have any value in and of themselves. They're only valuable because their value is derivative from the spiritual values. And if you have to sacrifice a spiritual value for the sake of the material value, then the material value no longer has any value. And that's why it's necessary and rational to give up material values for the sake of the spiritual ones if it's necessary, in the context when it's necessary.
Jacob, in light of what you're saying right now, I think I want to read Tony's next verse that he asked about, and then I'm going to read one more verse. And I think that one verse actually answers the other. So the question was Luke 6:30. Give to everyone who begs from you, and from one who takes away your goods, do not demand them back. And as you wish that others would do to you, so do to them. So this is Jesus' teaching about what you should do in reference to your material goods in some contexts. And like Jacob was saying, because of the spiritual good that you're going to be purchasing for yourself, for the spiritual good that you're going to be purchasing toward God's overall glory. So there's that verse in Luke, and Luke tends to be the place where you can find verses like that. But listen to this from Luke as well. This is Luke 16:9. And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into eternal dwellings. So, the same man who recorded Jesus saying the one recorded Jesus saying the other, same Jesus. So I think that's very strong support for the argument that Jacob is using about the context of you can be joyful in giving up something right now, knowing that it contributes to something else that's more important later on.
Yeah, and I think it's helpful to identify specifics. It often can seem like we're functionally being altruistic when we talk about the rational value that we're seeking in vague or abstract terms. So if all you say is, "Oh, of course, I'm seeking the glory of God," and then you go on and do everything that Mother Teresa would do, and that's all you have said to yourself, then most likely you really are being an altruist, because you probably aren't actually seeking any values, let alone any rational values. The glory of God is sort of a cheap cover to hide from yourself that you don't have any values. So that's why I would say, to test yourself, be specific. Identify, how is God going to be glorified in this? What specifically am I hoping to see happen in order for God to be glorified? And that will make it more real, so that you can identify the specific value, right? So instead of just, I'm gonna be self-sacrificial to the glory of God. Say, I'm going to give up this, say, an hour with my wife to talk to this atheist, for the sake of, and what am I hoping for? I want him to see the glory of God. I want him to become a brother in arms with me. I'm thinking specifically about what it would be like for this guy to be a Christian minister by my side in a year, for this guy to be standing next to me worshiping God in church a year from now, leading a church 10 years from now, and all of the impact that he might have by me investing this hour in him. Right? So be specific about the sacrifice, about the self-denial, and be specific about the value being sought, including the way in which you expect to see God glorified. Don't be vague and abstract about it, because then I think you probably will fall into sort of a functional altruism without realizing it.
All right, let's open up for some more questions. We've got 4 other guys on the call, so this would be a good time. Michael, I saw you unmute first. Go ahead.
Hey, so I got this is just a question both about what you've been saying and the Bible verses that Cody mentioned, with regard to Luke chapter 6 and Luke chapter 16. I was reading The Weight of Glory the other day, the C.S. Lewis book that I think is at least partially relevant to this conversation, and he talks about how the reward that we're given in heaven and the salvation of our souls are the consummation of our acts on earth and the things that we do to glorify God while on earth. So I'm just wondering in what ways an act can, or the reward we get in heaven can become a consummation. How it's a cause of what we do on earth, and how that's determined. Because while I understand that the chapter in Luke 16 definitely addresses what's in chapter 6, in what relation do those two have, and how is one a cause of the other? Sorry if that's a very general question, but if
I can speak to the idea of why it would be a consummation, and the answer to that is just that a consummation means that you love somebody, but you haven't fully expressed your love, and you're anticipating that you will, and then you do, and that's called a consummation. So you love the Lord, and you invest in that relationship, and you do the work to build and to store up treasure for yourself in heaven. And then you get to heaven and there's the treasure. That's the full treasure. Now, it was wonderful, the entire experience. Like if you're courting a woman and you're dating, you're never going to think, oh gosh, this dating was just so hard. I wish I didn't have to do it. I hope that you wouldn't marry somebody if that were the case. So that's why I think that it's a good analogy.
Yeah, and I'm sure there's a lot more to that final consummation than this, but at the very least, I think this will be a major aspect of that, and that is the moral acknowledgement and praise from God for what you've done. Right? What are we told that will be told to us when we enter the kingdom? Well done, good and faithful servant. The moral sanction that we've often not had as Christians, in from the world, or maybe from other brothers in Christ who have damned us for doing what we're doing, or who have said that we're doing things wrong, or whatever the case may be. But you endure, knowing what is right, standing on your moral integrity, and to have the Lord tell you, well done, I think is going to be at least a major part of that consummation, because that's something that you don't have in the here and now while you're doing it. You don't have that final restful experience of knowing fully that you accomplished something good. And I think that's part of the consummation.
What we do have in the here and now is what John describes in 3 John 1:4. He says, I have no greater joy than to hear that my children are walking in the truth. I think that's pre-consummation, but that's still quite an amazing joy to have.
Yep.
All right. I saw Matt, you had raised your hand. Go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, I had another verse that I don't think it at all dismantles the argument, but I think it's worth exploring. Romans 9:3, where Paul talks about, I can read it if you'd like, but it's where Paul talks about how if he could, he would like to be cursed so that Israel could see God's glory fulfilled in the end.
Jacob,
do you want me to read it?
Yeah, well, yeah, go ahead, Matt, and then I'll turn it over to Jacob.
It says, for I could wish that myself were cursed and cut off from Christ for the sake of my people, those of my own race, the people of Israel. And I just thought that was kind of an interesting verse worth exploring. And do you just, I mean, would you see that as just, when taken in context of all the other verses, as just him using hyperbole and not really? I mean, obviously he knows that that's not possible, but how would you deal with that?
Yeah, so I think as almost any good commentator is going to point out when they comment on that verse, he doesn't actually wish it or ask for it. He gets as close as possible. He says, I could. I think that's indicative of the fact that Paul realizes the contradiction that would be involved in actually wishing it or asking for it. But the fact that he says I could, I think we probably all could sympathize with that in various contexts. If you think about a loved one, say your wife or your child, or a sibling, or take someone who's very valuable in your life. Imagine that they're not a Christian if they're not already an atheist or not saved, and think about the intensity with which you want them to see the Lord. You want them to see the glory of God and love it the way that you do. And you might have that feeling that Paul had, that I could almost wish that they would take my place. But you hopefully wouldn't go the full way of wishing that, like Paul doesn't. He stops short because there is a contradiction there. If Paul actually said, God, condemn me to hell so that the rest of Israel can be saved, he would betray that he doesn't actually value the glory of God, and therefore doesn't actually value the rest of Israel seeing the glory of God. It would completely undermine what he's longing for. And I think he realizes that, and I think that's why he stopped short.
One other helpful verse, just to cross-reference, is the same man who said that also wrote in 1 Corinthians 9:27, I discipline my body and I keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified. So Paul does have other passages that lead us to think that he's considering his own well-being, and that does play into the overall calculation.
Yeah, I just can't imagine Paul, who says that everything else has become as dung, as worthless to him for the sake of knowing Christ, consistently also saying, I'll give up Christ for the sake of my brethren having Christ. Well, then you are lying, Paul. Then your brothers having Christ is now above you having Christ. So which is it? And that's really what it is. It has to be one or the other. Do you value your own relationship with Christ more than you value other people's relationship with Christ? Or don't you? And a lot of Christians might want to say, or might think that they need to say, I value other people's relationship with Christ more than my own, because they think that that's moral. But I think if you study Scripture, that's actually morally repugnant to God. What is morally praiseworthy to God is you as an individual saying, you're all I want. Think of David, the man after God's own heart, in Psalm 27:4. One thing have I desired of the Lord, and that will I seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord and to inquire within his temple. That is the man after God's own heart. That's the moral man in Scripture, the man who wants nothing above his own relationship with God.
The floor is open. Anyone else want to chime in with a question, especially anyone that hasn't yet? This would be a great time. All right, I'm going to read another passage that I think is a good capstone on this discussion, and that is Hebrews 12:2. Because after all, we are called to imitate Jesus. And I think that if we know what Jesus's motives are, and we're called to imitate them, then we're called to have that same motivation. So Hebrews 12:2, looking to Jesus, the founder and the perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. He did what he did on the cross for the sake of the joy that was set before him. That included our joy, and that also included the joy that he was going to have in bringing glory to himself, bringing glory to God the Father. And you also see that in Philippians 2 and elsewhere in Scripture, the amazing turnaround from becoming humbled to becoming exalted. Now, if we're told to imitate Jesus, who is willing to sacrifice something in the short range, to receive a greater payment back, to receive gain, then it does seem that the idea of Christian egoism is quite compatible with what we see in Scripture. Colin, you go ahead.
Yeah, I've just got something. I actually preached on this in our discipleship training for the past couple of weeks. In 2 Samuel 22, David, who has just survived the attempted coup from Absalom, his son, and he handled himself. He didn't do the right thing with Bathsheba, and he learned his lesson there, and God brought that in Absalom as a punishment for that. And David handled himself correctly here in the situation with Absalom, and he said, the Lord rescued me because he delighted in me. So the Lord takes delight in us. That goes back to what we were talking about earlier. When we do the right thing, God does take delight in us, and he shares that delight. And David, in verse 21, says, the Lord rewarded me according to my righteousness. He repaid me according to the cleanness of my hands. For I have kept the ways of the Lord and have not turned from God to wickedness. Indeed, I have kept all his ordinances in mind and have not disregarded his statutes. He says, I was blameless before him and kept myself from sinning. So the Lord repaid me according to my righteousness, according to my cleanness in his sight. And then David goes on to say how the Lord is faithful with those who are faithful. And I just think that that shows God's value. When we glorify God, God does receive that glory, but he shares that glory in turn with us as well. And when we do the right thing in this life, Jacob, what you were talking about, we do receive rewards for that in this life. God does see us through troubles. He does reward us for doing the right thing. But I'm always very clear to point out that if you're going through the motions and just serving God just so you can get some sort of reward out of it, you're not really valuing God properly. If you truly value God, you, like you said, Cody, you make that sacrifice. David was tempted to sin here, but he didn't do it. And he took that short-term sacrifice so he could get a long-term gain. And that's because David knows how life is set up. And that's what life is. You glorify God, and God does reward you for the cleanness of your hands, as David said. And I think that goes to this whole conversation here, that David realized that what he was doing mattered, that his life mattered. And when you do the right thing, that matters because you're accomplishing God's will, and God is a good father. When my children do something good, I reward them for it. When they do something bad, I discipline them, not because I enjoy it, but because, they need that discipline. But God does reward when we do the right thing.
Yes. However, I think that picture can be what some people will accuse rational egoism of when they might say that it's mercenary. Like your motivation is the reward that God's going to give you. I think the way to answer that objection is to shift just a little bit and recognize that the reward that you ought to be seeking is the reward of the pleasure of seeing God's will done,
right?
Of doing the good, the right, the just. So it's a pleasure in God's glory, and right. There may be additional rewards that He gives in addition to that, but the fundamental pleasure and motivation is in the fact that God's name is being lifted up through you acting righteously.
Right, and that's what I meant. That if you're doing it just so you can get something out of it, that's not right. That's not truly valuing God. If you truly value God, you work for His glory, and He in turn shares His glory back with us too. Yeah. So, yeah. I had one more verse. Just I don't want to do all the talking, but in Proverbs chapter 11, verse 12, Solomon says, "If you are wise, you're wise for your own benefit. If you mock, you alone will bear the consequences." So Solomon. I think he and Cody, you and I've kind of talked about this with this book I'm writing as well. That attitude of Christian rational self-interest is very prevalent in the book of Proverbs. So if you're wise for your own benefit. And Solomon does tell you in chapter 6, don't put up. I forget the word he uses. Usury. Don't put up. If you put up security for your neighbor, get out of it. It's not your job to live your neighbor's life, to take care of your neighbor at your own expense. You are to take care of your own needs first so that you can help your neighbor when the time comes, but it's not your job to live your neighbor's life for him, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah. Colin, I'm really glad that you bring that up, because that shows how this whole discussion we've been having the last hour is very practical to real life, present day concerns. Because in the culture today, there is this huge push to, first of all, everybody owes that they have to take care of their neighbor. And second, then let's make some laws about that, or let's guilt other people and try to manipulate what they think is right. So that's one of the reasons why this set of ideas actually has cash value. It has value today for us. And Jacob, I'd like to close by asking you, what are some of the other things that come to your mind, why these ideas really matter today for Christians?
Oh, man. Put me on the spot. Almost everything. But I think, let's see, to really narrow it down, there is an increasing aversion to the truth of God as presented in the Scripture, because of this altruistic morality. The more you look and see the egoistic God of the Bible, if you're coming from an altruistic standpoint, the less you're able to appreciate and glorify Him appropriately. It almost leads to a blinding effect where you start to ignore certain passages and certain doctrines. And I mean, that has an effect when we talk about things like salvation, and what would be right for God to do salvation, and in the gospel. And so that comes into effect in the whole debate between Calvinism and Arminianism. But even beyond that, when you get into issues of the problem of evil, but then also, and this is where it sort of hits the cultural and political road, when you start to apply your understanding of the gospel and of God's morality in the gospel to the Christian life. I wrote the article on Keller's view of justice, which actually equates grace with justice, and I think because of altruistic motives, and it ends up distorting the gospel. It ends up being that if we applied Keller's reasoning to the gospel, it would make God into a monster for seeking his own glory and for not saving everybody. And you're starting to see that in this whole social justice movement, because the social justice movement is very much motivated by a morality of altruism, where justice is seen as rooted in need, right? From each according to his ability, to each according to his need. So sacrifice yourself, do what's good for others, be others-oriented, be need-oriented, don't seek personal values, don't have a positive value orientation, be orient all of your positive values towards the lack of value, the needy of others. That's the whole idea behind the social justice movement. It's all rooted in altruistic, need-oriented, others-oriented morality. And it ultimately is going to distort the gospel, because God in the gospel is not an altruist. He's very much an egoist. He's jealous to get his glory in the gospel. That's why he sent his son, is to avenge his glory in the forgiveness of sins. And so I think you're going to see this start to affect a lot more things in theology. But then we also have it affecting a lot of things in politics and in culture. A lot of those things that we've been debating about on Facebook in recent weeks. And you can go back and see some of our discussions about justice and social justice from a few months ago. Go ahead, Cody.
And one final really big concern is not just how these ideas impact the theological world or the political world, but how it affects each individual person's life. There is a difference in the ability to get out of bed in the morning and do your work with joy when you have a value orientation versus when you have a self-destruction, self-abnegation orientation. Which is going to be the core of your moral compass, value or self-sacrifice?
Yeah,
you have
duty.
to choose. Or blind duty. It cannot be both at the same time. So, hey, let's close with this. I'm really glad Ruben sent this in, and he's on the video today, but just listening in. And he sent in Ephesians 5:25 through 30, and I was thinking of bringing up the same passage because it is so relevant to the topic. He says, the picture of this is from Jesus himself. He gave himself up for the bride, the church. Ephesians tells us the same in how we should love our own brides, yet Jesus loved his own glory, and this was his motivation for doing this and for loving the church. Husbands, love your wives just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself up for her so that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of the water with the word, that he might present himself, the church, in all her glory. See his motivation there. Having no spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that she would be holy and blameless. So husbands ought also to love their own wives as their own bodies. I would comment there. You ought to love your own body, obviously. And he who loves his own wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ also does the church, because we are members of his body. So as you're thinking through what does the Bible say about this question of our motivation, we encourage you to go to christianintellectual.com/egoism, pick up the list of verses, and the verses are written out so you can see them yourself, and journal through it. Think through it carefully. Do the work, because this is work. This is a pivotal issue that faces Christians today. We need to be doing the work on it. We need to be speaking about it. If you're interested in getting Jacob Brunton to speak at an event, reach out to us. You can email me, and you can see the email contact on our site. and we'll arrange a way that Jacob can come, hopefully, teach about this issue. It's an issue that he has studied in depth. Also, I'd like to encourage you to go to our podcast, christianintellectual.com. Episodes 4, 5, and 6 especially deal with these topics. And we would invite you to keep up the discussion. Thank you for being on the recording today. And thank you guys for all of your wonderful, insightful contributions. Looking forward to keeping this up in the future.
Thank you guys.